The exchange between Don Goldman and Pam Bondi didn't just catch attention inside the committee room. It sent ripples across Capitol Hill. What was expected to be a standard oversight hearing suddenly erupted into a full-blown political confrontation the moment Goldman locked onto the one issue Bondi clearly did not expect to face head-on. The sealed Epstein files and the sudden, unexplained shift by officials who once demanded transparency and are now backing away from it. In the opening moments, the tension is unmistakable. Goldman's voice sharpens. His pace quickens. Every sentence lands with intention. You can almost feel the room tighten as he speaks. Once again, we find ourselves in the Homeland Security Committee, supposedly conducting oversight of the president and his administration. And that should matter, because there are countless serious issues this administration should be answering for. Donald Trump ran on a promise to deport violent criminals who are in the country illegally. He called them the worst of the worst, but that's not what's happening. Instead, masked ICE agents are detaining immigrants directly from courtrooms. These are not violent offenders. These are not criminals. Many are people following legal immigration pathways, attending court as required, and attempting to comply with the law. Yet they are being arrested, detained under questionable authority, held in harsh conditions, and in some cases threatened with deportation despite having lawful status. You would think the committee with direct jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security would want to investigate this. You would expect oversight hearings on why members of Congress are being blocked from inspecting DHS detention facilities. There is a clear federal statute that gives both Republicans and Democrats the authority to inspect facilities where immigrants are detained, but instead, DHS refuses access. So here we are again, sitting at a Homeland Security hearing, while the administration undermines Congress's own legal authority to conduct oversight. And rather than addressing those abuses, the Republican majority steers the conversation somewhere else entirely, back to Joe Biden. Here's the reality check. Joe Biden is not the president. He hasn't been for 7 months. Yet hearing after hearing keeps circling back to the prior administration, while the current one is detaining lawful permanent residents, asylum seekers, and even U.S. citizens. And it doesn't stop there. This operation isn't limited to ICE. FBI agents are being pulled away from investigations involving terrorism, violent crime, child trafficking, and organized gangs. Instead of doing the work that keeps Americans safe, they are being reassigned to assist ICE in detaining nonviolent immigrants with legal asylum claims. That doesn't make the country safer. It weakens national security. Goldman argues that the committee should hear directly from FBI Director Kash Patel about how many criminal investigators have been diverted from their core missions. Americans deserve to know how much law enforcement power is being redirected away from real threats to focus on people who are not criminals. Some of these detainees are being held in Bureau of Prisons facilities that are not even suitable for convicted offenders. Conditions that are widely considered unacceptable are now being used to detain people who have not committed crimes. And finally, Goldman turns back to Bondi. He demands accountability. How many Department of Justice resources are being spent to detain nonviolent, non-criminal immigrants? How much manpower, funding, and infrastructure is being diverted while other serious threats go unaddressed? What began as routine oversight became something else entirely. A confrontation over priorities, over transparency, over whether Congress is willing to hold power accountable when the facts are uncomfortable. And that moment, when the focus shifted and the pressure mounted, is why this exchange is still echoing far beyond the hearing room. And while they were there, Goldman made it clear there was another question that could no longer be ignored. What is happening with the Epstein files? Donald Trump publicly promised they would be released. Pam Bondi said the files were sitting on her desk and that transparency demanded disclosure. Kash Patel spent years criticizing the FBI for withholding them. Republican lawmakers repeatedly demanded their release, insisting the public had a right to know. Then suddenly, after a month-long internal review, the message changed. Bondi and Patel now say there's nothing there, no evidence worth releasing. No material involving accomplices, co-conspirators, or anyone else connected to Epstein's crimes. And just one day earlier, House Republicans voted against releasing the files altogether. So Goldman asked the obvious question: what changed? He pointed out what many Americans already know. Donald Trump had a documented social relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. He attended gatherings. He spoke positively about him in the past. Those facts are not disputed. And now, according to public claims made by journalists and commentators, there are allegations that Trump appears in materials connected to the Epstein investigation. Some reports have suggested the existence of video evidence. Elon Musk publicly claimed that Trump is blocking the release of the files because he appears in them. Pam Bondi insists that nothing credible exists. Trump himself posted on Truth Social earlier that morning, saying that the material is fabricated and not believable, but to Goldman, that statement raised a different issue. If there's nothing there, why argue about credibility at all? Goldman argued that the American people deserve a clear answer. Either the president is mentioned in the files or he is not. And if he is, the public has the right to know the context, not filtered explanations or selective disclosures. Before he could press further, the room snapped back into procedural mode. His time was cut. A motion was raised. The chair moved to table it. Debate was shut down instantly, but the damage was already done. Goldman wasn't there to follow the usual script. He wasn't there to let the discussion drift into rehearsed talking points or vague reassurances. He wasn't there to let Bondi sidestep the question that has been hanging over Washington for months. From the start, his tone seized the room. He connected the dots between secrecy, shifting explanations, and an administration pulling federal agents away from real threats to focus on mass detentions of nonviolent immigrants. He laid out the contradictions plainly. Public safety was the justification, but the actions told a different story. One of misused authority, blurred accountability, and growing secrecy. By the time the gavel came down, nothing had been released. No documents. No explanations. No clarity, but the question remained suspended in the air, louder than before. If transparency was promised, why is disclosure now being blocked? And if there is truly nothing to hide, why does every attempt to ask the question trigger such a swift shutdown? That's the moment this hearing crossed a line, from routine oversight into something far more consequential. This wasn't just a case of poor coordination or bureaucratic mistakes. It was a clear pattern taking shape. Federal agents were being pulled away from counterterrorism and violent crime investigations to assist with operations that had little to do with national security. At the same time, congressional oversight was being obstructed, and detention facilities were suddenly off-limits to inspection. Goldman laid this out step by step, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Lawmakers leaned forward because it was obvious he was building toward something bigger. And then he went there. The turning point came when Bondi's confidence finally wavered, when Goldman asked the one question no one else had dared to raise so directly. He moved away from immigration failures and redirected the spotlight to the sealed Epstein files, documents that had become a national fixation. For months, officials repeatedly promised transparency. They said the materials were under review. They said accountability was coming. Those were their words, spoken clearly and publicly. Then the review ended, and everything changed. Overnight, the narrative flipped. Suddenly, there was nothing worth releasing. No names, no associates, no collaborators, no accomplices, nothing at all. And that's when Goldman pressed harder. What changed? Why did the same officials who once demanded disclosure now insist the public didn't need to see anything? Why did the tone shift only after the files reached certain offices? With each question, his voice grew sharper. Bondi could tell exactly where this was heading. Goldman reminded the room of something undeniable. The individual at the center of the discussion had a long, well-documented social history with Jeffrey Epstein. Public appearances, shared travel, positive comments made in the past. These weren't rumors or internet theories. They were verifiable facts, easily confirmed by public records and media archives. And that alone raised a serious question. Was the sudden secrecy about protecting national interests, or was it about protecting political reputations? Then Goldman took the hearing past the point of no return. He addressed the flood of speculation circulating online, not as established truth, but as widespread public concern that officials could no longer ignore. Reports claimed there were unreleased videos showing troubling interactions. Long-standing rumors suggested some journalists had seen still images years ago that never entered the courtroom. Online discussions pointed to recent remarks by a high-profile tech figure who hinted that someone might be personally blocking full disclosure because their name appeared repeatedly in the files. Goldman was careful. He didn't present these claims as facts. He didn't say they were proven. Instead, he made something else clear. When this level of speculation exists, secrecy only makes it worse. The government's job is to answer questions, not hide behind silence. And then came the moment that flipped the entire hearing on its head. An early morning social media post entered the discussion. It acknowledged that material exists inside the Epstein files. It dismissed that material as fabricated, but it stopped short of denying that the person posting appeared in the files at all. That omission landed like a shockwave. In that instant, the room understood what had just happened. The issue was no longer hypothetical. The questions were no longer abstract. And the pressure for answers had just multiplied. It was the kind of statement that didn't calm the controversy. It poured fuel on it. If the files truly meant nothing, then why say anything at all? Why acknowledge that material exists in any form? And why, as Goldman pointedly asked, did the same officials who once promised openness suddenly shut the door on disclosure? Bondi shifted in her seat. Her posture stiffened. Her tone grew tighter and more defensive. That was the moment the hearing began to unravel. She tried to reset the conversation, arguing that the review uncovered nothing legally usable, that the materials were fragmented, unreliable, or not credible enough to justify release. But Goldman wasn't talking about criminal charges. He wasn't asking what would survive in a courtroom. He was asking something much simpler and far more dangerous. Why was the public being kept in the dark? Why did the standards change overnight? Why did a process that began with promises of transparency end in secrecy? And why were lawmakers now voting to block the release of documents they had loudly demanded just weeks earlier? With every question Goldman asked, Bondi's frustration became more visible. She cut him off. She repeated the same lines. She spoke in circles, leaning on rehearsed phrases instead of clear answers. But Goldman didn't back down. He pushed harder, asking whether political pressure played a role, whether certain names inside the files were being shielded, and whether the committee itself had been misled. About the true purpose of the review from the beginning, the tension exploded when Goldman referenced the vote held just one day earlier. Members of the committee, many of whom had built their public image around calls for transparency, voted against releasing the files, against disclosure, against the very principle they had campaigned on. The reversal was sudden and jarring, and the timing only deepened public suspicion. Bondi insisted there was nothing worth seeing. Goldman fired back immediately. Then release them. If there's truly nothing there, transparency would put the issue to rest. If the files contain nothing of concern to ordinary Americans, disclosure would settle it instantly. The refusal to do so said more than any denial ever could. The room grew louder. Cameras snapped. Lawmakers leaned forward. Bondi raised her voice in an attempt to regain control, but the momentum had already shifted. Goldman had seized the floor, and everyone in the room knew it. Then came the moment that confirmed what many viewers already suspected, just as Goldman prepared to push further. A procedural move cut everything off. A member of the committee abruptly moved to table the discussion. No debate, no explanation, no follow-up, an immediate shutdown. Under committee rules, a motion to table is privileged and non-debatable. Once invoked, the conversation ends on the spot, and just like that, it was over. The majority moved quickly to shut everything down, cutting Goldman off in the middle of his question and ending the entire line of oversight in a matter of seconds. Bondi didn't have to answer, Patel didn't have to respond. No explanations were required. With one procedural maneuver, the push for transparency was stopped cold. What made the moment so unsettling wasn't only that the discussion was silenced, but how forcefully it happened. It didn't feel measured or thoughtful. It felt sudden, defensive, almost like someone hitting a panic button. And that reaction only strengthened the belief that the files weren't being withheld because they were empty, but because they contained something uncomfortable. Goldman made it clear that this wasn't just about one hearing or one set of documents. He warned that this kind of secrecy signals a deeper breakdown in the system of checks and balances. When agencies brush off congressional oversight, when officials refuse to provide basic information, when lawmakers block investigations instead of demanding answers, the system stops working the way it's supposed to. Even more troubling was the way national security was being used as a shield. Despite the fact that these files had nothing to do with active operations or ongoing threats, piece by piece, Goldman laid out a troubling pattern. Agencies pulling resources away from real dangers to serve political priorities. Oversight visits being blocked even when Congress has clear legal authority. Promises of transparency being quietly reversed without explanation. Taken together, it painted a picture of a government willing to bend its own rules when powerful interests are involved. In that context, the Epstein files stopped being just evidence in a case. They became a symbol of a larger crisis, a system that protects the well-connected while leaving the public. With silence and suspicion, the hearing ended without answers. But it left the country with a question that won't disappear. If there's truly nothing in those files, why fight so hard to keep them sealed? Why shut down debate so aggressively? Why silence the one lawmaker willing to ask what so many Americans are already wondering? Even strong defenders of Bondi struggled to explain the urgency and intensity of the shutdown. It didn't feel like confidence. It felt like fear. Now the question shifts to you. Is this sudden secrecy about legal caution, or is it something far more calculated? Should the committee release every remaining document and let the public decide what matters? Should officials be held to the transparency they promised from the start? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more in-depth breakdowns of political confrontations and the power struggles happening behind the scenes, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next.